Hi, good afternoon and welcome back. Hope everyone had a good lunch. Let me first start by saying thanks to this morning's panelists and presenters for a really interesting series of presentations and conversations. And let me add my thanks to Rafaela for organizing this conference and for inviting me to participate. My name is Matt Mulcahy. I'm a historian, I teach at the Loyola University, Maryland in Baltimore. And I think my main connection to this conference is that I study the history of natural disasters in colonial British America. So I'm sort of interested in the destruction of the built environment across the 17th and 18th century in the British colonies of the Caribbean and South Carolina and Georgia. What I want to do here today is start by introducing our panelists, and then we'll move on to the presentations. Our first presentation, and it's going to be a video presentation, and then Pauline will join us for the conversation, but she's prepared a video that we'll show when I'm finished here. Our first presenter is Pauline Kulstad-González, who has a BA in Latin American Studies and Anthropology from Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota. One of the fun parts about this panel is that I discovered that Pauline and I overlapped at Macalester. I was a senior her first year there, which is kind of fun. I foolishly stayed in Minnesota, a glutton for punishment, I guess, in harsh winters, and did my PhD there. She wisely headed to warmer climes and did a master's in Latin American Studies from the University of Florida, and then moved on to do a PhD in archaeology from Leiden University in the Netherlands. Pauline is a consulting firm, PK Research and Translations, that focuses on 16th century Spanish Hispaniola research, both archival and in the field. She specializes in 16th century paleography. Her work is focused mainly on translating and interpreting English and Spanish sources, providing administrative assistance, and organizing meetings with multiple stakeholders. She has worked as in-country liaison in the Dominican Republic for various international, commercial, and educational organizations. And as I mentioned, she's going to start with a video. But before I get to that, let me introduce our second speaker. Our second speaker is Nicholas Paskert. He's a doctoral candidate in African American history in the Department of African and African American Studies at Harvard. He's presently finishing a dissertation on urban slavery and the built environment in African colonial New Orleans from 1718 to 1852. And he'll be drawing from that dissertation in his presentation today. His research has been supported by Harvard's Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, the Charles Warren Center for American History, the Historic New Orleans Collection, and Tulane University's New Orleans Center for the Gulf South. He received a BA in psychology from Lawrence University. He has 2 BAs in addition in interdisciplinary studies and history from the University of New Orleans, and an MA in African American Studies from Harvard University. He has a forthcoming article that actually might be out. He can give us an update on that, entitled Coercing the Delta, the French Grammar of Control in the African Landscape of New Orleans, 1699 to 1732. And it was scheduled for publication in the journal Global Environment. And as I said, it might be out. So with that, I'll turn it over to Pauline, and then we'll hear from Nicholas, and then we'll come back together for some conversations and questions. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being virtually present here. Before starting, it is important to acknowledge that the land I am currently occupying belongs to the indigenous peoples, currently known as the Taino. This research is a preliminary study trying to answer queries based on landscape occupation, as opposed to the currently seemingly ubiquitous queries based on identity and plantation studies. Since the birth of the discipline, historical archaeologists have searched for the archaeological footprint of the African diaspora in the Caribbean. However, most of the research undertaken so far in the Circum-Caribbean has focused on the English-speaking colonies, on plantation settings, and/or on 18th century contexts. Little research has been undertaken at the beginning of Afro-descendant lifeways in the Americas, which occurred in urban settings in Spanish colonies during the 16th century. It is important to note that Spanish Santo Domingo was the first Spanish colony in the New World and later became the center of the Spanish Caribbean and most of the Americas for most of the 16th century. As you can see in this table, for 40 years, Spain was the only European colonial power in all of the Americas, as well as the Caribbean. It is not until 1616 that another European power arrives in the Circum-Caribbean. Although currently the island of Hispaniola is divided into two countries, Haiti and the Dominican Republic, in the 16th century, the whole island was a colony of the crown of the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, the current-day Spain. The first French settlers did not come to the island until 1630s, and the first large importation of enslaved Africans to the French colony did not happen until after 1685, when large-scale sugar plantations were implemented. Indeed, it was not until 1697 that the island was officially divided between France and Spain. And so this presentation will focus on Spanish patterns in the 16th century, and French patterns of occupation of the landscape will not be discussed. Once again, we were focusing on 16th century context in Spanish colonies and in urban settings. Unlike the later Dutch, English, and French colonial powers who focused on economic production in rural environments, the Spanish kingdoms of Castile and Aragon were more interested in creating urban centers to populate the landscape. By 1509, two large efforts to urbanize the island landscape had been undertaken on Hispaniola. The first efforts were undertaken by Christopher Columbus. He set up 7 fortresses running from north to south. The second effort was undertaken by Governor Nicolas de Obando. By 1509, he had organized these original 7 settlements into town and added 9 more. The 9 new settlements made up a complementary east-west axis to Columbus's north-south settlements. It is necessary to understand Spanish settlement patterns to understand early Afro-descendant lifeways in the Americas. The first Afro-descendant that came to the Americas was actually a servant of Christopher Columbus on his first voyage. This was no fluke, because enslaved Afro-descendant servants were quite common in urban settings in Southern Europe at that time. In fact, to understand Afro-descendant lifeways in 16th century Hispaniola, it is necessary to review African diaspora lifeways in Europe. The enslavement of African peoples was quite prevalent in the Iberian Peninsula, Italy, and southern France already in the 15th century. The diaspora there was divided into 2 large categories, enslaved and free. Most Afro-descendants worked in urban environments regardless of their category. The overwhelming majority of the work done was domestic, requiring the knowledge of Spanish language, religion, and general culture. Free Afro-descendants were known as libertos and managed to gain their freedom legally. Enslaved Africans were divided into 2 categories, de guardar and jornaleros. These 2 categories came to be due to the efforts to control the movements and interactions of enslaved peoples through a series of ordenanzas or slave laws. These laws stated that enslaved peoples should be de guardar or kept, meaning that they were not allowed to be out at night without their owners and were to be kept under lock and key at their owners' homes. In practice, however, this mandate to have enslaved people sleep in their masters' homes was not always followed. In fact, the second type of enslavement was implemented, which allowed enslaved people relative freedom of movement in exchange for a daily payment to their masters. These people became known as jornaleros, esclavos de gaño, or blacks for hire. Jornaleros were responsible for their own food, lodging, dress, and health needs, and did not have to be permanently at their master's home. Most enslaved peoples were owned by private citizens, but a sizable portion were owned by the king. These slaves undertook large-scale jobs, not always limited to the urban environment. Their work included building fortification walls and mining. Afro-descendants in Spanish Hispaniola during the 16th century were categorized into 4 major groups: Ladinos, Bozales, Libertos, and Maroons. Ladinos were enslaved peoples of African ascent, brought from Spain, who already knew Spanish language, religion, and culture because they had resided in Spain for at least a year. Bozales were enslaved peoples brought directly from Africa. Libertos were free Afro-descendants who came from Spain either as free citizens or managed to gain their freedom legally while on Hispaniola. The maroons were formerly enslaved people who had managed to escape their masters. Although African diaspora work on Hispaniola started out as a mostly urban, domestic, small-scale affair, a shift to large-scale mining and construction started at the beginning of the 16th century. This period coincided with the construction of the grid towns and higher gold yields. After a large number of indigenous deaths caused by working conditions and the smallpox epidemic of 1516 to 1519, an effort was made to switch the island's main mode of production from gold mining to plantation sugar. The idea was to change not only the mode of production, but also the type of workers. Yet, in spite of this new focus on large-scale rural work undertaken by enslaved Afro-descendants, documental research points to the persistence of work being undertaken in the urban environment. This was particularly true for work done by libertos. Indeed, these groups were not present in the same proportion in urban and rural environments. For the most part, work done by Afro-descendants in rural environments were part of large-scale undertakings such as gold mining, planting, and cattle ranching. This work was likely done mostly by Bozales. Rural environments would technically include most of the maroons, as they were believed to have been escaped from plantations and cities. Conversely, the work done by Afro-descendants in urban environments was at a small scale, mostly domestic. Unlike manual work, small-scale labor required the knowledge of Spanish for communication. This would lead to the assumption that most workers in the urban environment would speak Spanish. Like in Spain, a series of ordenanzas were emitted which controlled the movement and interactions of enslaved peoples on the island. The main purpose appears to have been to limit this escape of enslaved people. These mandates apply to both rural and urban environments. The first slave laws in the Americas were emitted in Santo Domingo in 1522 after a revolt in Diego Columbus's sugar plantation in December 1521. These ordinances first applied to all of the Americas, but later each capital city within the Spanish territories emitted their own related to their area of coverage. In Santo Domingo, no new ordenanzas were emitted between 1545 and 1768. The Santo Domingo's ordenanzas are notable in that they attempted to separate libertos from other Afro-descendants via particular privileges. This included owning taverns, carrying weapons, and selling other items besides charcoal and water in the streets. Afro-descendants in urban Hispaniola during the 16th century, as stated before, would have probably been mostly libertos and Latinos. Bozales would have been present working in large-scale affairs such as construction. De Guardar and jornaleros appear to have lived and worked like in Spain, with one important difference, which was that a set distance was set up to where an enslaved person could travel before they were considered a fugitive. This distance was 2 leagues, approximately 6 miles. In spite of the historical evidence of relatively large African diaspora in Hispaniola in the 16th century, the archaeological footprint exhibited in museums is relatively small. This is especially small considered the relatively large number of Spanish and indigenous artifacts prompting some to consider this to be a deliberate attempt to minimize or erase the African diaspora's role in Dominican lifeways. However, an interview with the director of the Historical Archaeology Division of Dominican Monumental Patrimony reveals a surprising reason behind this supposed snub. Few African artifacts have been identified as such in Dominican colonial excavations, particularly in the 16th century, and their presence in collections is negligible. In fact, most of what has been identified as African is already on exhibit. The problem with identifying African objects in archaeological context is not unique to the Dominican Republic. African American archaeology in the United States has also encountered difficulties identifying and collecting African artifacts. Eventually, certain handcrafted items, particularly clay pipes and a style of pottery known as colonial ware, have been identified as being produced by Afro-descendants. An additional caveat to the whole process is the fact that the enslaved peoples had little freedom to choose the objects they used in everyday life, necessitating the need to modify artifacts previously manufactured elsewhere. So, how to identify Afro-descendant artifacts? To understand this, it is useful to separate two concepts, the concept of manufacture and the concept of use. Different elements of how an object is constructed, as well as the sequence in which it is put together, can be a marker which can help identify a particular cultural group. However, the making of an object does not mandate its use by the maker, or even by her or his same cultural group. Consequently, when we study an artifact's use, we will derive more information from the context where it is found, as opposed as to how it was manufactured. Context is the spatial distribution of a pattern of the material assemblage left in the ground, and can be used to study ethnicity, race, and status. This patterning approach assumes that human lifeways follow an organized design. These patterns serve as material correlates for activities and cultural processes within a particular landscape. Moving to a larger scale classification to identify African diaspora footprints, that is, using geographical units as units of investigation, has brought to light unexpected findings which help explain the lack of data and artifacts. It appears that the wrong interpretive questions are being asked of the data during analysis after excavation. The first and most important being whether the presence of the African diaspora is being acknowledged at the site. A related question is if the presence of the African diaspora is acknowledged at all levels of analysis. No less problematic is the assumption that most of the Caribbean African diaspora was directly or indirectly affected by the plantation economy, similar to what happened in the southern United States. This view of African enslaved people is prevalent and appealing to both public and academia, as evidenced by the continual appeal of roots and similar stories that Dr. Peggy Brunache calls slave torture porn. This narrative presents a view that the vast majority of the African diaspora was enslaved on plantations, was allowed limited mobility, mostly within plantation boundaries, and was subjected to the grueling outdoor agricultural labor. In the Caribbean, this phenomenon is often referred to as the repeating island. The idea of the repeating island assumes a similar model regardless of the island and colonial power, given its reliance on the same mode of production, plantation crops, by enslaved peoples. This repeating aspect has made inference by comparison an attractive, albeit inadequate, research model. The repeating island archetype, however, is based on an economic system instituted by the English in the 17th century is not necessarily applicable to a Spanish colony in the 16th century. Indeed, the Spanish Empire was more interested in organizing the urban environment than the rural. These new standardized settlements followed an organized pattern which emphasized class separation as well as military ease. To expedite this population process, the Crown created a settlement model known as the Ibero-American Grid Town Plan. This model laid out cities and towns in a grid pattern with streets radiating from a central plaza and intersecting at right angles to form an orderly, rectangularly defined space. Here is a comparison of the center of Santo Domingo and the center of Madrid. Madrid's organic layout shows many places which would be difficult to defend militarily. Street alignments were due to more natural elements such as rivers as opposed to cardinal points and rectilinear lines. Indeed, the main elements of a grid plan town are the central plaza, rectilinear streets, the location of the cathedral within the central plaza, and the location of public buildings. The main plaza would be surrounded by administration offices, military headquarters, and elite residences, forming the town's physical and social center. Using this model, the Crown was able to politically conquer what is currently known as Latin America by 1573. The grid pattern was repeated over and over with smaller plazas with churches located in different neighborhoods. The houses of the wealthy were found around these plazas as well, but the plazas themselves were often occupied by their servants during the day. At night, the servants of the wealthy would sleep in the owners' homes, while at night the plazas would be filled with jornalero workers. The Ibero-American Grid Town Plan was divided into the Spanish town and an Indian town. Interestingly, there were no formal plans for a black town, a pueblo de negros. Rather, Afro-descendants were to share the same urban space as Europeans. Although officially Afro-descendants and indigenous people could not live in the same town because of fears of disease and abuse caused by Afro-descendants, the real reason may have been a fear of collaboration between the subjugated groups. To better identify areas occupied by Afro-descendants through archaeological evidence, the colonial city of Santo Domingo will be used as a case study. This grid plan city was first laid out between 1502 and 1509 in the area within the Black Rectangle. It was not completely populated at once, but rather in stages throughout the 16th century. In the 17th century, a perimeter fortification wall was put around the city. The fact that this wall does not follow the grid plan will be discussed later. Although domestic work is listed as the main labor of urban Afro-descendants in documentary sources, the most prevalent physical evidence of Afro-descendant labor in Santo Domingo are the constructed buildings. There's little doubt that the construction workforce had to be primarily African, given the large demise of indigenous people due to smallpox by 1519. The building of 16 settlements following the Ibero-American Grid Town Plan model in the span of 7 years at the beginning of the 16th century would have required a large workforce. Afro-descendants not only contributed brute force to the industry, but also served as carpenters, roofers, stonemasons, and bricklayers, amongst others, perhaps under their own supervision. Much of the work undertaken by Afro-descendants involved spending time in streets and plazas. Some may have even slept in them. Plazas are still being used today, as can be seen here, where a mobile vaccination clinic has been set up in a predominantly Afro-descendant neighborhood. Some archaeological work has been undertaken in streets and plazas, but questions about Afro-descendant heritage have not been part of the interpretation of the material. Other Afro-descendant work verifiable through archaeology is water procurement, hospital care, and pottery making. Where did these events take place? Pottery making was the second most common work undertaken by Afro-descendants. There is documentary evidence of pottery production in the northeastern African diaspora periphery settlements of Santa Barbara, and San Antonio in the 18th century. But no identifiable archaeological confirmation exists for this time period or for the earlier 16th century. As in Spain, Afro-descendants often undertook jobs unwanted by others, such as hospital work. Extensive documentation exists about a Alberto woman working in the Nicolás de Bari Hospital in Santo Domingo. Archaeological explorations are currently being undertaken at the site and will hopefully present part of the existing Afro-descendant archaeological footprint. Finally, perhaps the most promising archaeological study for our specific research is the recently completed archaeological investigation into water procurement in Santo Domingo. The study documents the city's quest for running and drinking water in the last more than 500 years since its foundation. The procurement of water was an important job assigned to enslaved African people. Documental sources point to enslaved people living in the third patio, close to the latrines of large homes. Enslaved and free Africans would be sharing sleeping quarters. However, few examinations of domestic archaeological contexts have been undertaken in large homes occupied during the 16th century on Hispaniola, with the exception of one recent excavation. This is partly in part to the fact that many are still occupied or were remodeled by architects or clients uninterested or unaware of Afro-descendant history. Additionally, unlike rural plantation settings, master and enslaved habitation was not spatially divided in urban locations. These multi-ethnic homes would have been found close to the central plaza or close to the lesser plazas around the city. Other housing for Jornal and Liberto workers would have been found outside of the grid. Perishable housing would have been used to build homes in empty lots also within the urban layout and as well as the end. Here we see an example of streets outside of the grid which do not follow the rectilinear plan. Here we see some perishable houses in alleyways and more perishable housing around plazas. On a final note, we return to the current map of Santo Domingo's colonial city and its organic fortification wall. This fortification, rather than following the grid, seems to accommodate a series of neighborhoods outside of the grid, which fit the description of Afro-descendant occupied spaces. Although it is completely possible that these neighborhoods could have risen after the building of the fortification wall in the 18th century, it is also possible to consider that by the 17th century, these neighborhoods were sizable enough and that they were considered part of Santo Domingo and needed to be included within the fortified city. But that is material for another research project. Thank you for your attention.
Before beginning, I would like to acknowledge the land I currently live on here in New Orleans, the native homelands of the Chitimacha, Colapisa, and the Huma nations before the arrival of the French in 1699. I'd also like to thank the Graduate School of Design for hosting such an important and timely conference, and to Dr. Rafaela Ginetto for inviting me to participate. I am looking forward to sharing further discussion with everyone at the conclusion of this talk and at any point in time in the future. So without further ado, my talk today is titled The Plantation Cityscape, African Slave Labor as a Circulatory System in the Urbanization of Colonial New Orleans. And I'll begin with what brought me here, which was rubbing together as a historian the mutual archives of visual material and textual material, where visual sources are our only guide. Were visual sources our only guide to the small world of colonial New Orleans, one would never get the sense that they were staring a slave society square in the face. I know this is true because I spent my early childhood in New Orleans, and nothing was more intriguing than seeing a colonial map of the ground you were presently occupying invite you to its likeness almost 3 centuries past. Dwelling in the rich visual history of the lower Mississippi Delta, a river subject to much fascination in the voluminous charts, views, plans, and maps that left behind 18th century engineers and surveyors, there is a sense of harmony which the textual study of colonial New Orleans immediately troubles. This disharmony between the imagined and documented landscape of the lower Mississippi Delta traces an outline of the kind of pathways historians tread among discrete archival collections, which at times seem to defy each other. They are in colonial Louisiana the kind of contradictions between words and images produced by slave societies at war with themselves. Yet in looking at the past of an urban landscape still accessible today as a public daily archive of presence, it is difficult to collapse the distance between the surface of French city plans and the deep symbolic resonance of a contemporaneous property inventory, which concludes in the orderly listing of enslaved individuals and families of African descent for transfer and exchange. Between the image and the text of colonial documents emerges a relationship of surfaces which has come to define the way we habituate ourselves to understandings of the past. The surface is easy, immediate, and intuitive. And history is, after all, written by the victors for a reason. Or to pull from an African proverb, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. But among the few things I've learned from nearly a decade of time spent with the archival repositories of a slave society is that to confront the organizing structure of white supremacy strictly in terms of its past seems a politically fruitless endeavor, given the urgency of the present. But also, number 2, that in dwelling with the documents like historians do, the archive also sometimes declares to everyone and no one that the hunter has no clothes. The disharmony I confront today in this talk is one of spatial representation. Perhaps the most intractable of spatial dichotomies, this paper will address the enduring impact of the urban-rural dichotomy on the work produced by geographers and social, urban, and architectural historians of Louisiana. The urban-rural model of Louisiana, composed of bucolic pastoral plantations up and down river from the bustling levee of New Orleans commercial entrepot, has only recently come under scrutiny by historians of slavery working in the African diaspora and the Atlantic world. Recent work by Rashana Johnson, Jessica Marie Johnson, Marissa Fuentes, Cecile Vidal, and Rebecca Scott has opened up new ways of slipping between and beyond comforting notions of urban-rural space by tracing the steps of enslaved people who established rival geographies, a reference to Edward Said, which Stephanie Camp so brilliantly underlined as mobility in the face of constraint. This spatial turn in studies of the history of slavery has, however, yet to find embrace following a century of scholarship surrounding the built environment of Louisiana, itself the inspiration for what Thomas Fearer and Joseph Roach called the Circum-Caribbean Rim of New Orleans. Taking a similar cue from Matt Sakakini's description of New Orleans music as a circulatory system, there is much about the riverine interculture of colonial New Orleans and its immediate environs or surroundings that the notion of circulation can help us to grasp. Enlightenment models of urbanization coincident to French colonization of the Louisiana Delta offered, quote, remarkably idealized conceptions of a fortified principal town as a symbolic metropolis of mercantilism. However, as Shannon Lee Doughty also observes, what arose in its stead was a new local model of urbanity that mimicked the plantation landscape. I depart from Doughty in that this mimicry of the plantation landscape and urban development was less a product of frontier neglect and more to do with the deliberate attempts to facilitate the control and subjugation of subject populations necessary to the functioning of the colony. This rather calls to mind the work of Clyde Woods and Catherine McKittrick, who theorized the long-term arc of the plantation block as an epistemology beyond any single material expression. I propose a regional model of slavery's landscape in the urbanizing Delta as one that can help us both to move beyond urban-rural dichotomies and core periphery models, which tell a story of difference and expansion, and instead move us in the direction of circulation in the form of social life conditioned by the circulating currents of the rivers and bayous, the basis of all transport and movement for more than almost 2 centuries. People of African descent, enslaved and dragged to Louisiana shores, were promptly coerced into movement they would immediately reappropriate for themselves, while also becoming unwillful actors in the dispossession of local indigenous nations from the Houma and the Chitimacha to the Biloxi and the Colapisa. Although it can be difficult to tease out, the impact of African presence in the history of Louisiana's built environment is a history of labor unbound from the world of a colony of slave masters. To follow the paths of people of African descent charted as enslaved laborers is to be confronted with the circulatory system between the like-minded space of the town center and the plantation, reciprocal zones in a broader region with little distinction among enslaved and indigenous peoples occupying the Delta. The development of a plantation cityscape in lower Louisiana was first and foremost the product of the kind of slave labor regime which environmental conditions encouraged French colonizers to adopt, one geared towards the pursuit of profit, undeniably, but one which in the process also developed a functional dependence on enslaved labor for colonial subsistence and survival. Something must be done, wrote Commandant of the colony Lemoyne de Bienville, about the people of distinction and capable of doing the public labor which supplies others with a livelihood. 3 years into the resettlement at New Orleans in 1721, Bienville characterized the king's exiles now in the colony as having, quote, no independent means of subsistence. The circulatory system in colonial Louisiana was a system of need, and this need drove the slave labor regime in contradictory directions. These contradictions are mystified by the ways colonizers represented the landscape in maps and plans from the outset. What we're looking at here, is an anonymous draft of a plan of Nouvelle Orleans, likely by one of the town engineers, most prominently Leblanc de la Tour. In the legend, we see itemized major structures listed from barracks and church to hospital and arsenal, warehouses and lodgings up in the top left corner. Along the surface, this is a city plan fully bounded in space and mind, complete with an imaginary rim of fortifications. Now, French engineers and surveyors had many reasons, some of them misleading, but some entirely within normal practice, because they are, after all, in the business of projection. But the situated town center, with its orderly grid of 6 rows by 11 squares, presents a uniquely disharmonious picture of the struggling, inundated frontier village in 1723. It also makes no reference to its neighborhood, the development of brick factories, rice paddies, cornfields, plantations, and mills just outside the Ring of Cypress, which enclosed the town at this early stage. And it is this view of the city, borrowing the bounded geographies of containment, which colonial regimes explored in the New World, that has most influenced the demographic interpretation of the city, and in so doing has delimited the horizon for understanding the nature of proximity, space, and social relations which defined life in the early 18th century. Historian Paul Lachance has produced the most rigorous and perhaps lasting demographic interpretation of colonial Louisiana, following some local censuses and not others, and choosing to describe the population of New Orleans solely on the basis of the residents within city limits. Lachance forecloses any opportunity to address city residents' immediate neighbors by passing a regional approach in the process, when his next demographic group consists of the lower Mississippi Valley, which spans several hundreds of miles. Shannon Lee Doughty, in her work Building the Devil's Empire, follows Lachance in her choice to limit her interpretation of New Orleans residents to those presently occupying the town limits within the grid system. But this has the impact of reducing our ability to see the city in movement, as it would have been recognizable to its inhabitants. In Building the Devil's Empire, she makes a convincing argument that we should understand that slavery's urban landscape began in segregated fashion, with slave camps and quarters restricted to the surrounding riverside coastal regions. However, Marcel Giraud has drawn our attention in his monumental 5-volume work on the history of Louisiana to the existence of several slave camps located in and around the present site of the St. Louis Cathedral, from which he makes no comment, but from my work is most likely the back buildings of temporary slaveholders in the early period, and equally the temporary shelter of enslaved labor camps temporarily occupying the city to aid in the erection of the church in the late 1720s, amongst several other buildings that enslaved people worked to rise from their foundations across the French colonial period. What is unintelligible from plans of the city, and indeed most documents addressing the town center, was just how often enslaved Africans were at work on the levees, drawing draining ditches, relining canals, transporting barrels of corn or rice, or joining with individual slaveholders in private contractual agreements to help repair or raise a building. The movement into the city of enslaved Africans came from all regions and for any manner of purpose. beyond the confines of containment, a camp situated directly across from the town center, what we now recognize today as Algiers, and in 1724 was a plantation laid out to become both a driver of the economy and an off-the-cuff slave depot, became the site of hundreds of enslaved people as property of the company who ran the colony in its first 13 years. From this point across the river, several observers have remarked in great trepidation the facts of seeing what they would call quote unquote Negro assemblies in the later evenings, and the pains that needed to be taken by the administrators to restrict the mobility of these laborers. This is a positive example, but most of the work that I've found working with enslaved documents comes from geographies of containment, which regrettably detail and define from the slaveholders' view how and when they can manage the bodies of the laboring populations that they brought to the colony. So this comes to us in the form of correspondence and administrators who, when I was reading them, struck such as I would say, disharmonious tone from the documents I was presently looking at when I would gain my bearings to say, okay, this is what I'm looking at. This is where, you know, Bienville is living, and this is where I'm understanding enslaved people are being moved for the purposes of repairing the levee. And in this this kind of dialectic that I experienced, it became clear to me that there were countless examples from both enslaved people and the residents themselves of moving in and out of the city on a daily basis. In 1726, the Company of the Indies passed an ordinance demanded that all inhabitants own property in town. This was a decree on September 7th, 1726, passed by the Louisiana Superior Council that demanded inhabitants and directors of distant concessions elect domicile in New Orleans so as not to hamper the course of legal affairs by the length of the trips to the bailiffs. The legal structure of Louisiana was so litigious and property disputes arose so immediately that it became necessary to constantly bring together the slave-owning inhabitants who were most well situated to own land and therefore enslave people, and then to engage in specious disputes over property lines. The material reality being that they were constantly caught between the lack of funds to hire an overseer and run a concession themselves, or spending indefinite time in the town center to adjudicate various matters. This is something that Thomas Ingersoll speaks to in his work, looking at court records in which most of the concessionaires in town habitually identified in the court transcripts as residents of Nouvelle Orleans, even though they were moving into town from downriver and upriver concessions. Another author, one of the most important primary source accounts of the city observed during his time in the 1730s, quote, that our French people who have settled in New Orleans or have moved there because for fear of an Indian attack, they could not remain on their farms, spend their time working in their gardens, and support themselves by selling their produce. And if they are lucky enough to have Negro slaves, they rent them out to others by the month. The going rate is 12 to 15 francs. Montagny participated in the urban-rural circulatory system when he moved upriver from his downriver plantation in 1737. He gives us a first-person account of the normal movement of residents from out and within when he observed, quote, about the month of March 1737, I was living in New Orleans with my wife, who had had 2 children with me. We were living fairly well, although I now had a job. I did have 2 houses, one for us and the other for my slaves, and I had a large, spacious garden where I worked and from which I was selling vegetables. I also hired out 5 separate Negroes to some men who were making bricks and tar over on the far side of Lac Saint-Louis. I rented them for 15 or 16 livres per month in the money of that country, keeping only a single Negro woman at home to make our rice bread. We raised turkeys, ducks, and chickens. We lived the life of city dwellers. The demographic horizons of New Orleans, if shifted from an isolationist, more segregated account to a more fluid and dynamic regional approach, which can account for what Edward Soha called the socio-spatial dialectic, in which city and countryside remained in permanent collusion in the ongoing production of space. Appealing to a circulatory metaphor, I would propose that the two slave society zones were constituted in reciprocal presupposition. Census takers produced accounts of the environs of New Orleans along the river as often as they limited themselves to the city limits. This is nowhere more typified than the census of November 24th, 1721, which was titled Recensement des habitants et concessionnaires de la Nouvelle-Orléans et leurs circonvoisins, or General Census of the Inhabitants and Concessions of New Orleans and their surrounding. We could translate circonvoisins more literally as surrounding neighbors, and I would highlight neighbors in particular. Likewise, the census of 1727, split into urban and riverine sections in most published accounts, was apparently produced in singular fashion on the ground and made no spatial distinction, simply titled Habitants in the Environs of New Orleans Along the River. But when you consult this census, you read a dichotomy in which one moves you into the town center and one says now continuing on to the river. But it appears, having not looked at the document myself, so I can't be 100% sure, but it appears from the title that this was in fact one unitary document, which is a small example of my point that those conducting the census for different reasons and at different times describe the city in different ways. And if we expand our horizons outside of the dichotomy of the urban and rural spatial parameters, new questions and new avenues open up. The self-appointed inspector of works and the most important figure in the built landscape of New Orleans was Claude Joseph Villars-Dubril, a resident of both the Tchoupitoulas plantation complex just 9 miles upriver, and in 1745, the occupant of a plot of land directly bordering the town center, in which he set up a brick factory to provide for works in which he would draw on his personal slaveholding access to African laborers, and at some time directly enslaved Africans and owned by the Company of the Indies. He was essentially the person most in control of the slave labor regime of colonial French Louisiana, and was at any given time or place able to move between 100 and 200 African people up and down the river, almost at whim. And this was something that both allowed the town to flourish in the sense that it gained a foothold in the Delta, but was also the prime example of the notion of building a city through enslaved people, literally through their manipulated movement into the piecemeal tasks. As I spoke earlier, I actually passed up a slide that I wished I hadn't. Maybe I can go back if I can. And speaking earlier about the segregated notion of the plan de la ville, the plan of the city itself. When I first encountered this document and attempted to geolocate the inhabitants and to understand the residents who own enslaved people within the parameters of what we can see on what is now Decatur, then they called it the Quay, and then back a block into Royal, is something that I returned to 6 months later and saw something entirely differently, which was that if you look right along the shoreline there, you can see the existence of a levee, which I had failed to notice in the first year that I had treated the document. But in reading the administrative correspondence of administrators such as Bienville over the course of from essentially 1712 all the way through the 1740s, there is hundreds of references to the need to move enslaved people from the countryside into the city to repair the levees. Well, first they have to build the levees. Well, there are inundations in 1722 that notoriously wiped out the town. In 1724, it's documented that 50 to 60 enslaved Africans were working on the levee in several different instances for months at a time. Beginning in 1725 and 1726, we start to read of the formation of Cecile Vidal, what Cecile Vidal would call the public slavery of the city, in which public works themselves become the expression of the tranquility of society best expressed through the coercion of enslaved people. So there right there is the tension that needs to be unbound and pursued, indefatigably for the foreseeable future. And within this contradiction, you can begin to unfold and follow not only the routes of enslaved Africans as they were directed by their slave masters, but you can begin to learn in offhand ways the rival geographies, the alternative landscapes, especially in the swamps that sat at the back of every plantation in lower Louisiana, that created what Gwendolyn Bidlow Hall would call a maroon network, but which, it's something that I have I would call an African landscape. It's something I'm working on my dissertation, but it's work that's and I hesitate to bring this term up because it's work that's in the middle of germination. Let me return to my material here. So now that I pointed out the levy, I want to talk about the regional urban. The plantation side of the urban cityscape, of the plantation cityscape. And in speaking of Claude Joseph Villars de Bril, what we're looking at right here is a 1924 rendering from a dispute over the blocking off and filling in of a drainage, a piece of drainage that extended from the river across the levee, that when it was filled in by one neighbor, forced the backing up and flooding of a nearby neighbor's property and ruined his goods and caused all kinds of financial problems. From this well-known dispute came not only this depiction, the most in-depth and almost priceless depiction of what the plantation cityscape looks like from the plantation end, but also the beginnings of what then was known as the Tchoupitoulas colony, named after a heretofore unmet and unknown peoples who are known only in the way in which their name carries on. And in this colony, there were, I'm sorry, excuse me, I have gone backwards and forwards. Let me back up and give you a description from longtime resident Lepage Dupratz that takes us from the urban cityscape into the surrounding River Rhine environment, giving a regional description of the river from longtime resident and slaveholder Lepage Dupratz. He notes, on the edge of the river, there is a levee both on the coast of the town and the opposite side, from English Turn up to the city and about 10 leagues above. A league is about 3 miles. It's a little bit less than 3 miles, which is about 15 or 16 leagues along each coast of the river. On the edge of the river, there is a levee both on the side of the town and on the opposite side, from the Détour de Langlois, or English Turn, to the town, and about 10 leagues above, which is about 15 to 16 leagues. Okay, I'm repeating myself. My apologies. On each side of the river, which one can do by carriage or on horseback, on land, as smooth as a table. Inhabitants frequently used the river and the bayous to move. It would take someone living in the Tchoupitoulas plantation region a matter of minutes to float down the river to the cityscape. So you can begin to imagine, once you know the real-time movement in space, of just how easily and proximate it was. Now, going back up the river was a different thing altogether, and there were overland routes depending on what time of year it was, where the water level was, if there was a convenient route that had already been marked out by indigenous peoples who provided the template for the entire settlement of the lower Mississippi Valley. Almost every settlement, what the French called vieux villages, old villages, they called them old or abandoned, but these were cyclical inhabited points that were taken up and then abandoned and taken up again, depending on the feuding and the termination of the landscape, depending on where hunting and what the river was doing. The upriver and downriver concessions, variously called habitations, and we're looking at the stack of about 4 concessions or habitations, one next to another. But what we would refer to as plantations were laid out in deliberate proximity to New Orleans town center, not only for the ease of egress down the river, but so in challenging times in the city, for instance, during the calamitous spring flooding of 1722, residents would be in a position to benefit from the food storage raised on the surrounding concessions. In 1721, there were 266 enslaved Africans residing in the Tchoupitoulas. This was far and away in 1721 the largest slaveholding section or colony, if you will, and in fact dwarfs New Orleans and is equally opposite and deserving as much attention as the cityscape in terms of its impact on how we understand the movement and lives of enslaved Africans, and also understand the material constraints they were up against. The next figures in 1726 list among the Chauvin brothers and Claude de Bril, self-styled inspector of the works, that 385 enslaved Africans were held on the concession, and this is only 5 years later. And we are witnessing in 1726 almost the height of the slave trade. And don't quote me on this, but if I'm recalling correctly, something like 19 slave ships visited Louisiana in a 12-year stretch between 1719 and 1731. Reading, if you read anything more than the sheer density of the slave trade, and then go back and revisit a quintessential picture of the French Quarter in the 19th century or the 18th century, you have to ask questions. In 1727, there were 314 people of African descent. In 1731, the Tchoupitoulas was the most significant establishment in the colony, as the enslaved laborers on that plantation were requisitioned to the city to carry out public works projects dating to 1721. The Tchoupitoulas plantation was located 3 leagues, or about 9 miles upriver from the town center. And as you can see here, the Tchoupitoulas, 3 leagues upriver from Nouvelle Orleans, which, if you can see right in the middle, is that small kind of imagined fortified zone with the grid system. The Camp Brûlé, only 2 leagues further up, and 5 leagues in total, which would be about 15 miles. I mean, you can ask people today how easy it is to flow down the river as far as going up with it. Of course, that's another matter. But there was a road along what we now think of today as River Road. It's not exactly the same road because the river has changed, but there was a road lining the river from Nouvelle Orleans on what you see as the inside bank heading through Tchoupitoulas and then all the way up to Camp Brûlé. And so when in the 1720s, Nouvelle Orleans experienced crises regarding river inundations in which they would flood 2 feet of the housing. The houses would have to be torn down, they have to be made up again. Hence the cyclical nature of the building landscape, which requires a certain kind of labor. If your buildings won't stay up and they need maintenance, then a slave society here doesn't look like one that's profitable. It looks like one that's barely holding on for dear life. And so what you see in Camp Brûlé and Tchoupitoulas is the proximity of floating down the river, and certainly in less than an hour's time, especially when for months at a time, the city in the mid-1720s began holding referendums with the slaveholders up and down the river to administer a head tax of 5 sols per negra, which would then allow them to mutually share the burden of paying for the loss of a slaveholder's time as their own personally owned slaves were brought down to the city to engage public works.
Hi, Nicholas. Sorry, I have to interrupt because we were kind of running out of time. We want to make sure that people have a chance to ask questions and have some discussion. But thank you very much, and certainly we can get to some more detail when we get to the question section here. So I'm briefly, again, if you do have questions, please put them in the chat, and I will try to get to as many as I possibly can. And welcome to Pauline, now live. Yeah, thanks to both of you for really interesting papers. And I just have a couple of very quick comments, and then you can respond, or we can get to some questions in the chat. Pauline's paper, let me start there, I think is a really important reminder of the importance of time and space when we think about the history of the Caribbean and slave societies across the Americas. However much the plantation complex may have spread across the region, the history of Africans in the region, right, involved much more than sugar and plantation labor. And this is especially true, I think, in the 17th century, the 16th century, and in places like the Spanish colonies of Hispaniola. I think she does a really nice job of highlighting some of the challenges of finding the archaeological footprint of Afro-descendants. And although I'm not an archaeologist, it seems to me that you've put forward a really useful framework for revisiting some sites that have not been really considered as possible sites of Afro-descendant material objects, to kind of look at them again in a new light and say, hey, this is where we're going to find some of these objects, and we can see these spaces in a new perspective. And certainly I think your attention to not just who created objects, but how they were used as a key indicator is something that's really interesting going forward. Despite the fact that I totally agree with your attention to time and space, I did wonder, and paying attention to differences across time and space, I did wonder, and this is my own, perhaps provincial view as an early American British historian, early colonial British historian, I did wonder if there's any use to looking at other urban centers in places like the Caribbean, even if they're in the English context or slightly different 18th century context, because there might be some similarities in the experience of urban slaves across time and space, either as a comparison or as a contrast. And I guess I think, there's been a lot of work done in Falmouth, Jamaica by University of Virginia archaeologists and students. Texas A&M did a lot of work in Port Royal in the 17th century. Mm-hmm. I just wonder if you think there's any value to thinking about urban spaces as a kind of comparative context there. The other question is a very mundane one, is I wonder, I wasn't clear, has there been a lot of work done on the fortifications in Santo Domingo as for archaeological work done, and any evidence of Afro-descendants material kind of objects there? And let me just quickly go to Nicholas, and then I'll let both of you respond. Pauline really calls us, urges us to kind of think about distinctions between urban and rural spaces and not just be overwhelmed by the rural plantation experience. Nicholas reminds us that these things are not always separate, and there's a movement back and forth, and that these zones are not kind of clearly demarcated, and that there are important reciprocal kind of obligations and relationships between the city and the hinterland, if you will, or the plantation zone. Two kind of quick thoughts come to mind. One, I was really struck in listening to you and looking at parts of the paper that I was able to read, how similar New Orleans appears to me as Charleston. They're really very similar kind of, at least in my reading. I obviously know a lot more about Charleston than I do about New Orleans, but they really, the experience you're describing really also seems to me to describe Charleston in terms of the connections between the urban area and the surrounding plantation zone, between the movement of people, of goods, but also of laborers kind of coming in and out of the city. And I wondered if you thought at all a little bit about that and its connection. And my one other comment and question was, you talk about the reciprocal zones in these broader regions and suggest that there was little distinction between urban and rural in the minds of enslaved peoples. And I was wondering, so I'm here in Baltimore, and I always teach Frederick Douglass. And Douglass, at least, again, this is 19th century, but Douglass at least suggests that there really is a key distinction between urban and rural zones. There's lots of movement, including here in Maryland between the surrounding Chesapeake zones and the city of Baltimore, the Eastern Shore where Douglass is, and parts of the Western Shore and the city of Baltimore. But for Douglass, at least, there really is some kind of key differences between urban and rural zones. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, maybe, and then I'll get to whatever questions folks have in the comments. Again, thank you both.
Oh, I don't know. Should I go first then?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
I'll go first with the comparison of Spanish and other Caribbean urban areas. I would think, and this I'll change, because after listening to Nicholas's presentation, I think I may change my point of view now, because I'm seeing that the French had The French and the Spanish seem to have a more similar way of looking at the urban environment and Afro-descendant work in urban environments than the English did. The English appear to have a much more, and I think it has to do with the fact that the English colonies seem to have a much more emphasis on private ownership than on government ownership, and in private and as a plantation owning. So the English seem to have to place much more emphasis on the private ownership and how the private citizen who owns slaves organizes their environment. The French and the Spanish seem to have more of a government. The government is the one who organizes this landscape. The government decides where to put cities, how cities should be, how they should be organized. As far as I know, the English don't have a plan of how to set up a city, how streets should look like, how that it should have a central plaza. Jamaica has it, and apparently the reason why, I think it's Spanish Town or Kingston that has a central plaza, and the reason why it's
Kingston.
Spanish Town.
Spanish Town too, actually. Spanish
Town. So I mean, the English used what the Spanish had left, because the English didn't get to Jamaica till 1655, and the Spanish had been in Jamaica since the 1530s. So I think in terms of comparison, I think in the Caribbean, in places like Jamaica, you could maybe do that comparison, but it eventually ends up going back down to how the Spanish organized the urban settlement. I think that was one question. I can't. Remind me of the second.
I was just curious if this is a very mundane one, but I'm curious if there's been any archaeological work done on the kind of fortifications and things. You mentioned hospitals and houses, and but I wondered if there had been.
Yeah, well, there's been work done on the forts, but the analysis hasn't looked at what the Africans did. So they were mainly looking at the type of artifacts that were found there. They weren't thinking of the fact that the Africans were the ones who built the forts. So that's something that needs to be done, is go over archaeological work already done and then analyze it from the point of view that the Africans were the ones who built it, these fortifications, and then we would get different information from what's available now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Matt, thank you for your questions. I'll take the second one first, which was about, and maybe I did lean a little bit heavy-handed on the little distinction that enslaved people would have seen between the separate poles of a plantation cityscape. But I guess I do that to try and overemphasize the natural kind of continuity that existed that's so hard to see, that makes me want to, because I think for the most part it is true, but certainly an enslaved person in Louisiana in 1720 would know every single difference that there would be between the rural and more urban-like areas. But at the same time, this tension exists far beyond the early colonial period, and it's the kind of work that I think Clyde Woods really speaks to in terms of talking about with his blues epistemology, about the plantation block and about the relationships that we still see today. Frederick Douglass, if I recall correctly, it was Maryland and Baltimore where he would have seen a true urbanized, heavily dense space, and New Orleans in the 1720s is a spit on the end of the earth. It's barely, if you the establishments up in the Tchoupitoulas, just to take one example, probably it sometimes looked looked far wealthier and more civilized than what was ever in the town center. If we wanted to call one a town center, it just so happens that we call Nouvelle Orleans the town center. But if the associations that come with that are about a certain kind of urbanization, I think it takes quite a while to see New Orleans actually as an urban space. And while most of the on-the-ground observers refer to the city as a ville, they refer to it as a town. It's arguable, how urban New Orleans is for 60, 70, 80 years. And a part of, and that's both what makes New Orleans a little bit different from other places, but also makes it useful because it's a variation on a theme. And in this variation, when you see such a small scale struggling slave society flourish into a huge one in the span of, 10 to 20 years in the early 19th century, it makes you have to look differently at what was going on because the material parameters are so incomparable to, they're comparable certainly, but they're also incomparable to a lot of places that we're familiar with. And in this regard, it is the microclimate, it's the small scale, it's the moving up and down the rivers from settlement to settlement, and the awareness now, because the French would have seen the plantation cityscape the way that they've showed it to us, then even if that's not necessarily the real way we should be thinking about it, enslaved Africans would be poor to not understand how the French were operating so that they could get on top of that and try and navigate around it. So again, it is something of a real thing, even though it's not of a real thing, because if the colonizers act like it's true and it has a material impact, then you have to respond to it to get around it. And in that way, I would argue that in this case, there is a plantation cityscape in existence. And then to piggyback on your other question, it's between, tracing property records and between, I'm not by training a Romance languages scholar. I've taught myself French, I'm familiar with it, but it's arduous for me, and I spend a lot of time on it. And it's a small subset of what I think are. And even having this conversation and giving this talk is, I think, a relationship that you were absolutely right. There are interesting. It's maybe the most interesting things about New Orleans and Charleston are where they differ. Because they're so similar, it's really, really elucidating to see where they're not similar at all. Because where they are similar, it like it's the back of your hand, and of course, it's just of course. But I'm actually curious because I think the parallels with Charleston, I guess, would be there. I'm wondering how well this idea, this model for the development of racial capitalism through the production of space and the requisition of indigenous lands and exploitation of laborers. I suspect before I went to Charleston, I would want to look at Natchitoches, I would want to look at Natchez, and I want to look at other parts of the globe that have slave societies that are deeply involved in rivers of empire, where the waterway is the primary unit, because that has such a big impact on what circulation looks like, and why circulation matters so much here, because of how it defines everyday material experience. So, and while the further you get away from the delta, maybe the less that becomes. I'm not quite sure. Maybe it's applicable to non-riverine communities, but my suspicions first and foremost was to look at other delta regions and to look at how power trickles out through waterways.
Yeah, certainly. And, this is one of those annoying kind of commentator questions in a way, kind of, can you do some more work by doing comparative things?
I'd love to.
But it is striking. And Max Edelson's work on Charleston, which highlights its river connections in the Low Country and things, might just be useful because he's looking at some of the same kind of systems, I would say, that you're looking at. So it might be a useful kind of connection. Let me get to a couple of comments and questions that have emerged in the chat. And one of which is, both your papers highlight the use of enslaved labor for kind of public works projects, whether it's building levees or fortifications and working in the city. And one question is asked, given that enslaved people were used to shore up levees that broke, thereby giving their lives to the city for the sake of the city, has there been any discovery of entombed persons in the studies of these various landscapes? I guess any kind of human remains found in in any of this archaeological work?
Well, we did find some remains in fort in the central part of the Dominican Republic, but we're not sure whether that was related to the building of the fort or if that was part of the fort was destroyed by an earthquake. So we're not sure whether or not where it came from. But that's about it.
I think in the case of New Orleans, you could ask that question up and down the Mississippi River because they were building, I mean, the levees built in front of the French Quarter were just the first of a grand extension and were, you know, extreme sites of labor constantly because of their need for maintenance. I'm not aware and have not come across anything that I've read personally that references the burial of enslaved people on the riverfront, but the river shifts so dramatically, and that was 300 years ago that the sand isn't even the same anymore. And at the same time, from what I know of Shannon Lee Dottie's work, and she's done archaeological work behind St. Louis Cathedral, I know they found a lot of really fascinating artifacts that spoke to indigenous trade, but I can't recall if they found any like actual human remains. But my suspicion is that would be the last place that I would look, because there were already established habits of this kind of off-the-cuff notion of purity and you know, moving. Nobody would want at all to. People were happy to go out of their way to move dead bodies to the back of town. It was always overflowing. It was always low value. It was always the site where people who had less had to do more to barely go. And that was where, I mean, and I would be surprised if one found anything along any levee along the river, although I could absolutely be wrong. But certainly I think more to the case if we look at where a lot of these labor camps, these temporary labor camps, these annual temporary labor camps took place, that underneath, and it's hard to get at this because the land is owned and you have to ask archaeologists and Shannon Lee Dottie about this, but that there are definitely more bodies under New Orleans than we know about. And that always informs people's ability to kind of fetishize the landscape as a haunted place, right, because it was early on.
Let me get to another question here. And it is, if I can read, I'm getting old here, right? What role did the agency of the enslaved play in the formation of colonial landscapes, considering the multiple struggles and escapes for freedom? I'm from Salvador, the first capital of Brazil during the Portuguese colonization. Here, the struggles and escapes for freedom of the enslaved gave rise to the Colombos, spaces of collective life outside the colonial order.
Well, I think what I'm gonna say is related to another project I'm working on. I'm working on a project with Dr. Teresa Singleton, where we're trying to find these escaped slave settlements here in the Dominican Republic. And actually, this is piggybacks kind of on Rafaela's comment. In 1655, Penn and Venables, Penn being the father of William Penn, came to Hispaniola to try to conquer the island for the English, and they were not able to do so because there was a free slave settlement or free maroon settlement in the northern part of Santo Domingo. We're not sure where. And also there were libertos, and there were also some Ladinos who were conscripted by the government to fight against the English. So the reason why we still speak Spanish here and not English like in Jamaica was because of this group of Afro-descendants who all got together and fought against the English, and they felt like it was more important to continue to be part of the Spanish Empire than to become part of the English Empire. So William Penn's father wrote a lot about, and quite an admiration about what was going on here Santo Domingo. So I don't know if it had anything to do with his eventual plans of organizing Philadelphia or not, but that there was this connection to this, and the fact that it was the Afro-descendants who fought against the English. It wasn't they were the main bulk of the people who were fighting against the English. So and it was both enslaved and free that were fighting at that time.
I would say that, I mean, as far as the formation of colonial urban landscapes is concerned, I mean, enslaved Africans built it. It doesn't get any bigger than that. They didn't just build it; they maintained it. They didn't just work through it; they embodied it. They had short lives and passed on. I mean, that's not necessarily true. I mean, it pains to describe how, the truth of how formative enslaved Africans were in the building of the colonial urban landscapes, as well as the free people of color community that was built up around the enslaved community. And those communities sometimes were in tension, but those communities sometimes also looked out and protected each other. And that changes based upon which time you're looking, depending on where you want to look. But as far as the overall trajectory of New Orleans is concerned, there is no bigger architect or founder of the city founders of New Orleans are not Bienville. They're not colonial administrators. These were Canadians looking for a way to recline in the good life and found they got off more than they wanted. And suddenly they were in a struggle for life and death for a while. Suddenly found themselves in the center of a slave society. They had a role in the founding of the city, and that will always be true. But enslaved Africans have a far bigger claim, and it's not. There's such a thing as you design a building or you build the building. There's a literal element here that is often lost about the physicality and the material relationship. And in that sense, you still see now, even though it seems to be diminishing a little bit, John Hankins runs the Mastercrafts Guild here in town, and up until this most recent generation, the history, everyone's familiar with the history of Creole African skilled laborers, and enslaved laborers were skilled laborers themselves. And sometimes that means they were skilled at the management of time and endurance, because it's a skill to endure and do the things that they did and still walk out in one piece. So I also think some of our evaluations of how we evaluate labor are a little bit skewed. But I mean, you could look at the landscape today and talk to anybody of African descent who has African descended family in town, of which there are still many in town, and still make a claim for kind of possession of the city, despite the kind of capitalist tourism industry that we live under here. So, I mean, there's maroon communities all throughout the 18th century, into the 19th century. It's countless. I mean, I could go on, so I suppose I'll stop.
Was that a hand, Pauline, that you wanted to add something, or?
No, it was something else.
Okay. We're about to run out of time, and since I can't, I'll assert moderator privilege here in a sense for one quick comment, which is, as somebody who studies natural disasters, and it's already been touched on a little bit, but of course, one of the other essential roles that enslaved people play is the ability, both these places, New Orleans and Hispaniola, Santo Domingo, experience multiple and routine natural disasters. So these are not, the idea of building a city, it's a continual process, right? Because these places get destroyed so frequently. So there's the building, and then there's the rebuilding, and there's the rebuilding after that. And the continued process is one that, so it's not just that these are founders or builders, they are, the ongoing process, and enslaved labor is absolutely essential to that process in the 16th century, the 17th century, the 18th century, going forward, right? That these are spaces that are routinely destroyed, and people who are at the bottom are forced to do the labor, not only their regular labor, but also the labor of rebuilding as quickly as possible. And I think that's another element of the landscape has to be rebuilt in a way. And we've got a couple comments in the chat here saying thank you, so we'll take that as a sign. I thank you both for your presentations and comments, and thank the audience for theirs, and we'll get ready for the afternoon session.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pauline.
Yeah. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Matt.